You guys ready to get started? Okay. So again, this one's going to be an introduction to the AWS Amplify toolchain we talked about in the previous session. I want to just kind of explain what it does, how it works, and then we're going to spend the later part of it just installing it, make sure everybody can run the command. And then I'll run through a quick demo of what some of those features might look like, the category-based features like auth. I'll run through just so you can see and how it's built, and then we can run through because we'll be using that in the next session this afternoon, and then a little bit next tomorrow we'll be using it. So a lot of these features that we talk about and demos and workshops will be based on the Amplify CLI. So again, I'm Dennis. I don't think I've introduced myself last one, but I'm a developer advocate on the mobile team at AWS in Seattle. So, and I like to just talk to developers, so I get a great job of like talking to you guys and learning, not just talking to you, but learn. I learn a lot from you all when I come out here. So anytime you have questions offline, feel free. I'll be around all day today, tomorrow, and Thursday. And anybody online, if you have questions during the talk, feel free to put it in the notes in there on the side. And then Adrian is standing by, and he'll pass on some messages to me on my phone. So I'll be answering questions online as well. So what is Amplify? So Amplify is an easy-to-use JavaScript library and powerful toolchain for building cloud-powered mobile and web apps. So the piece I won't talk about today is the JavaScript library, which is how AWS Amplify started. But we're going to talk about the toolchain piece of it, which is the two pieces of the toolchain. One is the GraphQL transformer and GraphQL Codegen. So this is automatically generate code for GraphQL queries, mutations, subscriptions, and type schemas. Now, if you're not familiar with GraphQL, then that might not really be helpful to you. But in the next talk, the workshop, if you're new to GraphQL APIs and you want to learn, the next session is going to be great. We're going to talk about a lot of this, of transforming, of building a model, because there's a schema part of that. And you specify a model format, and then it'll build out that type schema for you and build out those queries. So like if I was a native developer in iOS, I could create this model. It'll create the schema for me and then generate these type schemas in a Swift code for me that I put in my app, and I can make API calls to GraphQL via AppSync. So that's the part of the Amplify toolchain. And then the other part of CLI, which we'll be talking mostly about this week, is creates and configures the AWS services from your local environment. So you can add and modify category-based features. Somewhat like the serverless framework we talked about, like SAM, but this is more focused on category-based for mobile web application developers. So mostly the front end, as if we're in the terminal and we have a web app or we have a native Xcode project, and we run the app, and then from there we can add auth, and it's in that same local environment, and it'll update a configuration file, like a constants file, with those endpoints of those features that we've enabled. And I'll talk about that, how that works. So the GraphQL transformer, briefly I'll go through, which we'll talk more in detail in the next one, which you define your API in the GraphQL schema definition. That's the definition you're talking about, and the model, and then it transforms into this CloudFormation template that implements your data model. So if anybody's ever used GraphQL or AppSync, this is a super powerful tool that allows you to just specify a model, and then it'll build out everything for you behind the scenes and send that out. So then you just make the API calls. And the Codegen piece is the automatic generated code, which I talked about. Like if you're a native or web developer, it'll generate that code for that framework. So if I'm doing an iOS Swift app, and I say, okay, here's my schema, and then here's the transforms that I want to do, the queries, the mutations, then it'll automatically create this API to Swift file that I'll use, and I call that as my API from the device into AppSync or GraphQL. So the toolchain is the CLI, and in addition to what we talked about for the GraphQL pieces. But creates and configures AWS services from your local development environment. So that's really it. That's its ultimate goal, is allow you in your local environment, just like AWS Unified CLI, where we can do S3 copy. If anybody using that, AWS S3 LS, if anybody runs that right now, it'll just list your S3 buckets. So that kind of value we'll bring in for the developer in our local environment. When we do a demo, hopefully it'll be a little more straightforward. So how does it work? It's important because what it's doing behind the scenes is it's using CloudFormation and nested stacks. So if you haven't used CloudFormation before, but it's, anybody use CloudFormation? Anybody built a template and like actually deployed it? It's difficult. It's, you know, it's a learning curve for sure. And so what we've done is taken that and say you enable these features, these services, and it creates these templates. So it's basically like a CloudFormation template builder for you. And then when you do an Amplify push, it'll push those resources in there as a stack and then configure resources. And then if there's anything related to your app locally, it'll update that endpoint and put in those pieces of the application. So when you launch it, everything will be there in your local environment. It allows you to add, modify configurations locally before you push them and execute in your account. So if anybody's used like Mobile Hub before, it's sort of like what Mobile Hub used to do in the console, and then we've taken it into the console, and now we're taking it back to terminal command line and allow you to automate that so you can add or update features. So is that making sense? When we talk about categories, we're going to say add auth, and behind the scenes, it's going to create a CloudFormation template for that, for best practices, for like specific, like the default standard is a username and password via Cognito user pools, and then it'll also create the security, the IAM roles for that. Did you have a question?
I was just gonna, it sounds a little similar, at least as the CLI tool, like maybe as Elastic Beanstalk a little bit, but more of like.
Yeah, so there's various tools for AWS. You know, the unified AWS CLI, which I talked about, which is really powerful. You install that and you can list all your resources and you can deploy things. This thing just sort of based on that, but takes it to a new level and just categorizes those essential and core services for mobile and web development. Yeah. And allows full transparency in the process of customizing your resources. So in the past you may have seen where you deploy the resource, you're like, okay, I have no way to customize that. It's proprietary and I have no way to use it or customize it. So the idea is if you're familiar, you can deploy this and then customize that template before you push to the cloud. So if you want to add certain features or certain sets that are not available in the Amplify CLI, you can do that and have that capability. So I'm going to talk about the categories now so that it just kind of puts everything in perspective. So the CL categories, analytics, talk about, so all these will be like, once we install it, will be like Amplify, add analytics, Amplify, add authentication, and then it'll go through and just query you based on the information you want. Some will be default, some will be like, okay, specify names, custom, whatever it might be. API, so we have the option of REST, which is the API gateway plus Lambda we talked about, which is the nice RESTful endpoint. And then GraphQL, which is the GraphQL hosted service by AppSync, which allows you to create a GraphQL API. And then database, which we use DynamoDB. And then Lambda, you can create a Lambda function and put that in front of for API gateway. Or hosting on S3. Anybody host any information on S3 right now? Super powerful and great just for hosting websites, storing objects, whatever it might be. But you could do a simple hosting solution there and drop it into S3 and then front it with CloudFront, put your SSL certificate on there, and you got this nice static website for little to no cost at all for the month. Yeah.
Is there a way to change the database from that?
Yes. Yeah, there's different ways that we're talking about. Oh, are there different ways to use the database? Or are there different database like NoSQL, or you want to choose RDS or something like that? At this time, not via the command line, but there's options to modify the CloudFormation template or put in a request in GitHub repo and say, okay, I wanted this feature, how it might work. Yeah, and again, this is community-driven, open source, not specific for AWS, but it was supported by AWS, and the community is also driving some of these features. And again, the storage piece is just simply setting up an S3 bucket and then setting permissions. Now, the important piece about this category is we talked about, remember all the services we talked about with AWS? We're breaking it down, and the categories are not just setting up analytics, it's setting up, like the simplest one is analytics, right? So behind the scenes, we're talking about Amazon Pinpoint. I can go to Amazon Pinpoint and enable Pinpoint, we're all good. But remember, we go back to the AWS call. If we're calling from our mobile or web, we have to authenticate that call. So how do we do that, and what rules do we set up? So by default, we have this set up so it's using IAM roles with Cognito identity pool, which allows those users to anonymously send events to Amazon Pinpoint. And then if you want, you can allow those users to authenticate and then send even more information based on analytics. So the whole thing is cycled through. Another really simple use case, which is sometimes users get stuck, is an S3 bucket. Really easy to set up an S3 bucket on the console. But then when you're talking about security and fine-grained control, like access list or permissions, we could get stuck. And so sometimes developers, not all of them, but they'll set up, like, open up the bucket and be able to just throw everything in there, and we'll close it down later just to make sure it works. That's when we talk about best practices here, is have it locked down by default, and then you can open up little pieces of it and provide fine-grained control. Yeah?
When we store objects in S3
Mm-hmm.
and access them on the mobile app, it's kind of from a performance wise, it's very slow in terms of like images or videos or anything. Using the Amplify, is there any like performance improvements?
Yeah, so she's asking about the storing objects in S3 and they're slower, and will Amplify correct this? No, and S3 should not be slow. It just depends on the tool, the framework that you use. And like if you upload images to S3 via the console, yes, it's slow. There's a lot of overhead. We don't focus on speed. We just want to throw in those objects from the cloud. So you want to use like tools like the Python tools or the AWS CLI, asynchronous, multi-part upload, a lot of those things. And a lot of us focus on the transferability in the SDK as well. So we have S3 transfer utility that you can use and transfer objects quickly from the device into S3 directly. So it should never be slow. We could talk about how slow or what you're expecting, but yeah. Yeah, send and retrieve should be really fast for S3. Yeah. For yeah. Yeah, so the question is, he's asking about the IAM rules, and it's for developers or users. So it's both. So as a developer, when I'm using Cognito or setting up in this situation for authentication and roles, I set up, or this will set up an IAM role. So IAM roles, and then the roles are associated with access policies. So as a developer, with this tool, we set up these roles, an auth role and an unauth role. Those are the only two that we set up. And then the users will assume the role. So when the user logs into the app, so if they're unauthenticated, they would launch the app, and they want the app's going to send analytic events to Pinpoint. They're going to assume the role, which is part of the unauthenticated role, IAM role that the developer set up. They get temporary credentials from Amazon Cognito. They use those credentials and send events directly to Amazon Pinpoint. That's it. So we set up the roles, and then you can go into deep fine-grained control of groups and users and admins and all that. But by default, you have the unauth role, which is meaning the users are not authenticated. They just download your app, started using it, and then in that role, behind the scenes as a developer, we create access to it. Whatever we want to have them access on our resources, we provide. And then in auth, we would typically provide a little bit more details. Like in the storage, we could allow them to upload all the images they want to a public folder, right? But if they log in, then they'll have access to a specific part of that folder or that bucket, and then we can control access to that by their login. So they'll have a unique identifier at that point, and then they have fine-grained protected access to that S3 bucket. Right, yeah, we don't have anything system like auth0. That's what Cognito's doing for us. Yeah, that's what Cognito's doing for us. So, and there's two pieces of Cognito really quick, is the user pools, which is you think about username and password, email, and then you log in basic auth. That's what it's there for, just like you would with a social provider, Google or Facebook. But then there's the identity pool. So the identity pool part of Cognito is the one that says, okay, this user's coming in, I want to give them a unique ID. If they haven't authenticated, I'm going to give an ID, and then they're going to assume this role. I'm going to give them credentials, the key and secret, right, because that's required for every AWS call. I'm going to give that person temporary credentials, and they're going to assume permission from that unauth role. Whatever that access is given, then I'll make that call on that behalf. If they don't have permissions, then I won't be able to make that call. And that's it. So it's doing, and behind the scenes, it's doing the tokens, the refresh, all that's done behind the scenes. You don't even need to worry about it. So when we talk about JWT tokens, we don't technically need to worry about that in most cases because the SDK is doing that for us. So, and yeah, the OAuth structure. Yeah, talking about, the question was, is this about the OAuth? Yes. And this is all about the OAuth piece. So when we talk about Google or Facebook, it's really just an OAuth provider that's providing the federated identities for Google and Facebook. So instead of having our own service, we identify and allow our users to log into Facebook, and that token management is done behind the scenes and refreshed. It says, yes, this person is a Facebook user, and identified them, and then they assume the authenticated role at that time. So just think about the unauthenticated as kind of anonymous or device authenticated, whatever you might want to do it. And the different use cases depend on what you want out of your user. Yeah, that makes sense? So the feature-based, category-based is what we're focusing on to try to draw in and answer that problem of like all these services and then going into these different console services and enabling them all, because we're not applying best practices, because you have to have knowledge of all the different pieces. So it's not just S3, it's not just cloud storage, it's not just database. We want to be able to get those users secure access and scalable to those resources that you own. So you want to protect not only your resources, but then you want to protect those users that log in. Like let's say we're doing a photo sharing. We want to be able to protect their resources so that nobody else can access their photos but them. So, and if they log out, they have no access to those photos. Okay, I'll go through some of those categories briefly here. Amazon Pinpoint. So when we say analytics, behind the scenes we're enabling Amazon Pinpoint and the IAM roles, right? Almost always we're doing these IAM roles for the project. So create and configure new Amazon Pinpoint resources, record events from the client application, automatically record session data. So a lot of this is automatically records session data. A lot of this is the SDK that goes through, and then records auth signups and sign-ins and auth failures. Analytics are super important. There's the free tier with Amazon Pinpoint, and then $1 per million events after that. So the default collection is demographics. Remember, we talked about the device, the user, what country, what carrier, everything you want to know about that user. And then if you want to collect even more information, you send custom events. So if somebody did an in-app purchase, somebody made a certain level in a game, whatever it might be, you want to make sure you collect all that information so that later we can debug issues, we can create new features, we understand our user base. Haven't even mentioned this, but the messaging part of it. So we can't message our users and start engaging with our users, which is really important, until we actually collect analytics. Otherwise, we're just going to be broadcasting to our users and say, hey, download this app, or here's a discount. We want to be able to focus on those users, what they're doing, and how they're doing it, so that we can give them relevant notifications at the right time and the right place. Certain things like, I don't want to be sending notifications to everybody in all the countries. I want to send the same notification at 5 p.m. their local time. That's very valuable, right? Because I don't want to send somebody say, hey, check out this new Netflix video at 2 in the morning, and all of a sudden, like, in Brazil, like, no, I don't need that. But if you were able to say, I want to send this at 5 o'clock everybody's time as they're getting off work, it's very relevant and it's time sensitive. So you want to be able to get it to them in that environment. So you want to understand their local time zone, what language they're in, all those things that you want to collect. Without analytics, you're just blind and you're just sending notifications out. As my kid downloads, he's 9, he downloads these games, and the push notifications are crazy. And they come like every 5 minutes, it seems like, you know, do this, do that, do that. It's like, and it's like 2 in the morning. It's like, I don't think my kid's playing. Some kids are playing games at 2 in the morning, but the point is, it's if they would just focus and be more relevant, it would be helpful. But so the other piece is Amazon Cognito. This is the big part of it, keeping your secure access to your resources and your users. So remember, you're protecting both and allowing your users to sign up and sign in. This is powerful because if you don't want to have users log in, they just launched the app and they're unauthenticated, so they can still make calls to your resources. So if you want to just do simple cloud storage, allow them to send events through Pinpoint, whatever it might be, SQS, whatever, you can allow them to do that without too much mechanism. Yeah.
Does Pinpoint also emit events or just data and analytics in general for non-session activity, like just general visitors or
Yeah.
general visits, like without a natural session or sign-in?
Yeah, so the question, does Pinpoint offer other than the session data? Yeah. Yes, by default it does. The default session, which is every time that person launches the app, it does the session, length, duration, time on the app. And then it also collects the demographics.
I'm sorry, so that's just app specific. I thought it was also for web traffic.
No, this is app specific.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. It so collects all the demographics, and then on top of that third piece, as a developer, you would send custom events, that anything you want. Like every time somebody shared on Facebook or every time somebody did something, you want to be able to track them. You can keep track and say, okay, are they using this feature? Are they not? Yep. Every time it crashes, every time somebody logs in and logs out, whatever you want to do and collect, you would send those as custom events. Yeah. So REST API we talked about allows you to create an AWS Lambda function and an API gateway. Again, we can go to API gateway. We could use SAM. We could use any of the templates. But this sets up just a nice Lambda function, API gateway, fronted with access through the IAM. So they can authenticate, and then they give them access through API gateway. Anybody use API gateway Lambda API? Okay, great. Super powerful, isn't it? It's just nice. I mean, really that's what it's all about, is when we talk about mobile, web, and modern, having a great API is essential, because then you could say, oh, here's the API. I'm calling from a Mac. I'm calling from Windows. The toaster is going to call it. Whatever it is, it's all the same as long as you give them access and give them some way to do to access your resources. Again, another thing nice about API Gateway is you can rate limit, you can throttle, you can offer API keys. Really great tool to have. It's another layer in front. Instead of calling S3 directly or DynamoDB directly, you go through API Gateway. So it's your choice. Again, you have several choices, but if you want to go this way, you have that control. So if you want to do resell your API, you know, like if say we're a weather app and we have this tons of data and we have an app that connects to the same API, we could sell this API to other developers who want to put in 5-day, 10-day forecasts and sell them $10, $20 a month, and calling the same API that we're using in our app. Our app might be ad-driven. They may have other features in their app, but the idea is you have this app, and then you can control it and bill through API Gateway, through throttling, rate limiting, API keys, whatever it might be. So think about that when you're building out this great API and you got this mobile app. It's like, let's expand it. Let's just give this great information out to everybody else. Or the flip side of that, maybe you don't have any data and you haven't collected anything and you haven't done anything really, and you want to utilize somebody else's API. You could actually front to API Gateway, and then Lambda will actually call something like a third-party service, you know, like a food delivery service or something that's public and available free, and then you put a front end onto it like a voice enabled. So like something like where you're looking up Chinese restaurants in the area, I just front that with a voice enabled and say local Chinese restaurants within 5 miles, bam. So you don't have any data, you haven't stored anything other than you're just calling your API gateway to Lambda. Lambda's calling a third-party API. So there's a lot of ways to make money without having a lot of data in the back end, just different creative ways to add to the API. So this one scaffolds the Lambda function, the Lambda code, and configures API gateway to call the Lambda function. And again, with security best practices with Cognito as a front end for authentication. So we talked about the REST API. The GraphQL API, which we'll be talking about in the next session after lunch, allows you to create an AppSync GraphQL API, configure AppSync, and then you actually can perform queries, mutations, really like get, put, post, and then subscriptions, which is that real-time piece from the client. So that's really great. So really all it is get, put, post, and then the real-time like WebSocket type of connections where on a device, if I'm, maybe I'm listening to a certain feed on the device, I can subscribe to that. Any changes will automatically be pushed instead of pulling. So it's better on battery, better experience all around, and that's available through the AppSync GraphQL API. And again, this will be something where we're in the console, we have our app in the console in the same directory, and we're deploying these services, and then at the same time it's putting in constant files or updating text files so that when we deploy it, it'll have all that information for us. So database API, Amazon DynamoDB plus Lambda plus API Gateway, so full-on database solution. And I think we'll talk a little bit about that next one in the architecture in the next talk, where we might configure API Gateway, Lambda, and configure. Again, these are the key essential pieces to getting the backend set up. And then it doesn't matter whether you're a web developer, IoT, embedded devices, whatever, you just have this nice setup. All best practices, secure and scalable. So you just go and make the API calls and you're done. And we decide. And again, Lambda Services create and configure. think I already talked about that. But same thing, so you can invoke up and then push changes, and then you can configure Lambda functions. And then if you want, it may be like Node.js at first, but then you go back to the Lambda function and change the code behind. Everything else, the mechanism's still the same. Amazon S3, again, we can go to Amazon S3 console, create a bucket. But remember, it creates, configures the bucket for hosting, configure Amazon CloudFront, publish assets to S3, and then send updates directly to S3, just like we could with the AWS Unified CLI. And then we can manage user content. We can make public, protected, or private. So remember we talked about the access for unauth and auth. So if we don't have our users authenticate, they can maybe access all the public folder within our bucket that we owned as a developer. And then we can provide them protected or private storage within that same bucket if they're authenticated. So in the IAM role, we would have an access policy in there. So they would say / and then username, and then have access to that. So anytime they want to read and write, they have only access to that one piece of the puzzle. And that could scale to millions of users. So that's great. So here's where part will kind of be a little bit interactive. If anybody has their laptops and haven't installed this, and one gal asked about Cloud9, and I don't know if it works with Cloud9. I haven't tried it, but it should work with Windows and a Mac or if you want to SSH into a EC2 Linux if you want to do that, you can do as well. But one of the ideas, I want to make sure you guys understand what the Amplify toolchain, the CLI, does, and then make sure you guys can install it so when we start running these commands, we can actually deploy. And then everybody got credit this morning for being here? Okay, great. And again, we could just destroy these resources, and if not, most of them are in the free tier, very little cost, especially today. I mean, not even pennies because most of them will be in the free tier, but be understanding that might cost you money if you continue to use these resources. So npm install -g at aws-amplify/CLI from terminal or command line from CMD from a Windows. Who's installed and have it configured already? About half. Who wants to do it right now? Okay, let's do it right now. All right. So I'm going to switch back because I think I got this one slide. So I want to copy. I don't know if I have this text. So I'm going to switch out of that because now we're going to be interactive. And those online, I'm going to see if you have any questions about it. But we're going to go through online, and then there'll be a few questions hopefully that will address it. And I already have it installed. I'm going to pull up my terminal, full screen. So first aws-amplify.github.io. Okay. And then we're going to click on Getting Started. And then everybody's got an account already. And then we're going to install the CLI. I was going to just use this to copy. So verify that you're running at least Node.js version 8x. And if you go to the Node.js, gentlemen, yeah. So you can do like 10, which is like, and then it says 8 something LTS. Just do the 8. It's just totally fine. Then you can upgrade later. It'll give you that suggestion. So make sure Node is running and run that command to make sure it's there. And then I'm going to go ahead and just run launch terminal, the good terminal. And then some of you may require like a sudo privilege. Mine will probably fail because I don't have the privileges. So I'll do sudo. Let's see. I'll just do this. Okay. So this is going to install the requirements, the necessary tools for allowing us to do the CLI. Remember, this is part of the tool chain. So it'll give us access to the CLI. It'll give us access to those Codegen pieces for GraphQL and AppSync and a few others. And if you already have it installed, I'm going to go ahead and open this bigger. Everybody see that okay? So we do amplify -- version, and then that should give us the version of Amplify 0127. So at least you know you have the right version there. Oh, a little shaded there. Bam. Oh, or dim the lights or something. Yeah. Let's see if, oh, maybe it might be a problem for Twitch, but yeah. Okay. Just those front lights. Okay. So anybody installing it now? Okay. And then the other piece, so if you already have, remember we talked about the AWS Unified CLI, which is the CLI for managing all the tool sets for AWS. If you already have that, then you don't need to do a configure because it'll automatically use those credentials. But if you do an Amplify configure, what this is going to do is have us log in with your credentials to the console. And I'll log in here. And if I go back here, oh, that's a good question. So he's saying, how do we use a different profile, which I'll get to the point. So if you already have the AWS CLI and you have what you call as managed profiles for AWS, then when you do an Amplify init, when we initialize the project, it'll ask us if we want to use an AWS profile. And if we have them available, it'll show you and drop down. You can say, I want to use this profile. And that's the same thing here. So if we go here in the console, all it's doing is going to have us create a specific region. So when you have profiles, everybody's familiar with the AWS CLI, there's regions specific. So there's a default region if you always deploy to US East or US West 1, 2. And US West 1 is not available, which is this area. But when you set your region, and then that's based on the user. So the profile that you use will be using this default region. Yeah, well, unless you have a config. If you use the AWS CLI, then it should just work and use the credentials that you have there. Do you have the AWS CLI installed? Oh, it might, but it still has configuration. That's all it needs. Yeah. So we'll do Amplify init, but I want to make sure everybody has run through this. So the configuration piece, you would select the region, and then we could specify a username if we wanted to. We could just call it SFO Amplify. And then what it would do is launch here and go into IAM. So what it did is launch the IAM. Remember we talked about IAM. So there's an IAM user that's going to create called SFO Amplify. And then say, I want programmatic access. Yes, because this is where we're going to use this key and secret and put it in. And it's going to create a profile for us. So essentially, this is creating another profile if you want to do that. It'll show up in profiles for the AWS CLI as well. So again, by default, gives you administrator access. You can change that if you want. And then just hit create user. So in here, I'll delete this user right after this talk. But we'll have the key and secret. Again, this will make the call. So now we hit enter, and it's going to asks us for the key. And then I'll go back here and copy the secret, paste it in here. And then here's our profile name. So I'm gonna call it SFO Amplify. Remember, we did earlier, we named the user. So the user is SFO Amplify. In this case, I'll just call it the profile. And again, this will be the profile that we use when we init project. And I'll show you what that looks like next. And that's it. So anybody still trying to configure? Is that pretty simple? So again, if you have the AWS CLI, we'll automatically use those credentials, or if you want to set up that way. Yeah. Command amplify, command not found.
There's a command not found.
Oh, okay. So this, yeah. So his command's not found as NPM, right? So you got to NPM. So now he's got to step back a little bit. So if you have never used command line tools in development, then you'd have to install NPM first, and then Node, and then go that route. So I can talk to you after this at lunch. Let's go through and we can install NPM Node and then the CLI. So that's what he was running into. Anybody else having issues? Okay. Yeah, I can't support both Yarn and I mean should work both with Yarn and NPM and they're both package managers. Yeah. Okay. Good. Do you have a link to it? Yeah. Yeah, and if anybody has downloads it, you said there's a good tech, is it a blog or is it? Installing Node on EC2. Yeah, so if anybody uses the Linux EC2 of the Amazon Linux, it automatically has the CLI there and you just need to configure it. So you just do AWS configure. Yeah. Yeah. So if it doesn't put it, should be, so on a Mac, it's like dot in your local folder, .aws/credentials. It's credentials as a text file. So do a VI or open up that file and you'll see the credentials in there. So you'll see the profile names with a key and secret. I don't want to open up mine because I have all my profiles in there. But you see that? Oh yeah. Okay. So to the point here, so now we have Amplify installed and I have it configured. So so now what we usually do is we start a project. We either create a new project or do whatever we want. So in this case, I have my user directory. So I'm going to just go into my app. I just have an Xcode project. And then I'm going to remove this so I can just start from scratch. Ignore me for a second here. Okay, so this is a simple Xcode project. I'm in my local environment. If I launched Xcode right now, it would launch the mobile app completely offline, and it's ready to go. So that's the idea, is any kind of React Web, React Native app, you would set up this environment, and now we want to cloud enable it, and we want to add these features. So what we would do is, first thing we would do is amplify init. And what this is doing is initializing the project and asking you a few questions like what kind of default editor. And again, this doesn't come up unless you're editing or viewing a Lambda function. So it doesn't really matter what you choose here unless you specify you don't want to really always use Visual Studio Code. And then here, depending on what project you have, it automatically identified this as an iOS project, which is great. So the CLI identifies as Android, iOS, JavaScript. In this case, iOS. And this matters because when I enable these features, it's going to go put that endpoint. So for Android and iOS, it's going to put an AWS configuration.json file, which is, think of it like constants. So when I enable this user pools or identity pool or auth or analytics, it's going to create the endpoint in that file for me. So when I launch it, I'll be able to connect to it. So there's nothing there now. So if I say, okay, iOS, and then do you want to use an AWS profile? So hopefully, remember I did SFO Amplify, so I say yes. So I have a default, I have a burner, and I have Amplify user and SFO Amplify. So this should be pulling in from that, yeah. Are you in a JavaScript app? Or, yeah, we haven't started anything. If you want to just create anything, if you have a JavaScript application, web app, whatever, it just doesn't matter. As long as it's in there and it'll identify that project. And if it doesn't identify it, specify it. But if you're just in a root folder with it's empty, then it doesn't really help, but it's not going to hurt anything. So in this case, I want to use Amplify. And so what this is doing, it's going to say, I want to use the credentials that I just set up for this profile, the key and secret, in that region that this default profile is defaulted to. And that's it. So it's going to go to the cloud. It's going to set up some templates, get it ready for deploying these features. So it hasn't really deployed much of anything. It's just kind of setting the stage and ready to go. And make sure I have permissions. I'm going to update a bucket and an IAM role. Yes. So remember, the CLI toolchain is for all the projects, right? And then when you do an Amplify init in your local environment, that's per project specific. Yes. Yes. Yep. Yep. So yeah, in your local environment, as you're running localhost or run open, close, Xcode. Yeah.
So this finished creating the user
So you created the user, and so are you back at the command line? That should be it. Once it comes back and says you created the user, and one sec. Okay, and you ran through the whole configure, Amplify configure? Okay, that's where we are now. So grab any folder or any project that you're working on and go to that folder and then do an Amplify init. And what that will do is initialize this project specific. Okay, so now we're here and we have all these, remember we talked about the features. So I'm just gonna add auth just for fun. Once we've initialized this project. So now we can do Amplify add and then anything. So in this case, we want to do, let's do analytics because it's easier. So we'll just do analytics. It's super easy. So we say analytics. And again, this is the solution to going to pinpoint and then creating permissions and doing all that. Figure this is saying, okay, you want to add analytics, give it a resource name. I'm going to call it my app. And then this is the question where we talk about apps need authorization to send analytics. Do you want to allow guests and unauthenticated users to send analytics and events? So all this is saying is, remember we have the auth and unauth role available to us. This is saying in the unauth role, set the permissions so that this user, all these users that don't authenticate can send events to Amazon Pinpoint. That's all it's doing. I mean, it's a little wordy, but really that's all it's saying. So when you see anonymous or unauthenticated, we're applying an access policy to the unauth role, allowing your users to send events to Amazon Pinpoint. And you'll see this again probably come up for like S3 or some other services. So, and by default, when you see this command line, you'll see the capital Y or lowercase n automatically defaults to capital Y. If you just enter, it'll automatically default to that and say yes. So all it did, and remember, we haven't pushed anything yet. So all it's doing is configuring this CloudFormation template to deploy these services and this connection, this whole piece of it. Does that make sense so far? And then if we do an Amplify push, now it's going to take that CloudFormation template that it was built for us and then push it to the cloud. Well, until I say continue. Say, yeah, sure. And again, the prompt there. And that's going to go through a bunch of speed stuff, tell us about CloudFormation and all those things. So it's building it out. And then what else it's doing is, since we're in our local environment and I have an Xcode project, it's going to create that configuration file with the endpoints in there. So it should have a Cognito endpoint and the Amazon Pinpoint endpoint in there. So when I put that in my Xcode project, all the constants are built there for you. So if I delete this analytics, it automatically delete my configuration file. So one of the common requests from developers was like, okay, wait, how do I keep this in sync? And now we have a way of like, okay, if I delete or add these features, it's going to automatically update my project configuration that I need for when I cloud enable it. So again, this is creating the auth role, the unauth role, and Amazon Pinpoint. And then allowing us to send events unauthenticated or authenticated, whichever one. It's updating that policy for allowing us to send events. Yeah.
Should we just do the print command, run this, or what do we do?
Oh, you said, yeah, you have the build. So that's a different project. So she's in a JavaScript project, which requires like, what folder is the bin? Do you want to build the project? And you can go through that, but that's a different use case. I was just demoing like the Xcode project. So yeah, it depends on if you're JavaScript or Android, all those, they'll ask you different questions based on that platform that you're doing. And then so you'll run through that. Well, if it depends on if that's something you run on your NPM or your React app or whatever it is. So you decide if that's something you run or wherever your bin location is. Yeah, and I can go through that offline. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah, pick JavaScript. Good question. Okay, so now I've deployed it, and now if I do an Amplify status anytime for this project, it'll show me that I've deployed auth and analytics. And again, the auth piece, which isn't really, haven't set up authentication yet, is just my unauth role, which setup is for credentials to allow us to send events to Amazon Pinpoint. So that's kind of the basic of how the CLI works. And again, see if I do an LL on here, you'll see the configuration file was added as well, and it puts in the information here, my endpoint, the pool ID, region, and then other details. So my default region for the pinpoint targeting and analytics. And then as I add or remove, again, from the CLI, it'll update that command. So how are you connecting to the app? So when you connect to the app, so the app has the static file. So if you want to launch it, we're like in Xcode, in this situation, we have the configuration file. We would launch Xcode, add this configuration file, and then the next step is add the SDK, right? So this is like deploying the services and putting in the configuration file for you, and that's it. So it's allowing you to set up this backend environment in the project, and then in the next steps, you could actually check this into GitHub or code repository, wherever you want, and then you have it all in one directory, one project folder. Yeah. No. So he's asking, are we giving permissions to developer or like other, or wait. Yeah. Right. Correct, yeah, so he's talking about the configure as the administrative goal. So that was just the default. I mean, you can control and narrow it down to only access certain features that you want or certain permissions. It doesn't have to be an admin user as a developer. And then, yeah, on your machine, that is a profile set up so that that user has access to whatever resources are enabled. So admin, pretty much, you can create any resource you want. But we do admin because there's, in one of these, or a lot of these features you enable is the IAM roles. And IAM roles is kind of like, wait, I can create other users to use that, right? And so that's a powerful tool, which usually requires admin type privileges. So, yeah, so the question was, how do we give them permission, or how are ways to like limit that access to those developers? And the way to do that is, instead of giving them the administrative group, give them access to only what they need. You know, like maybe that we can add a managed access policy for just Amplify. You know, that just the bare minimum that gets you to those features or enable that. But unfortunately, these are for developers to create some IAM rules and some powerful pieces. But there's no way other than creating or limiting that access policy per profile. So that's why you want to create a profile per developer or per team, and then give them limited access to those resources. So you may not want to give them admin, give them something else like IAM role creation and a few other tools that they can create these resources. Yeah. Yeah.
Speaking of DevOps, how would we manage different environments within Amplify? Like if we want to also spin up like a test environment or something.
Yeah, so he's asking about the test, like a blue-green environment. If you want to, how do we set that up in Amplify? And there's not, you know, a defined way to do that, and that's something we're working on with the community, trying to figure out the best practices of figuring out, like making the clone of this or copying it, or say, I want to deploy this. You know, the question is, I want to deploy this same configuration in US West 2 in Oregon, and how do I do that? And so those are the things that we're talking about now, is trying to figure out what we do to copy that information, what comes along, what's cloned, and make that available. So another ask is for a developer to come in and say, I want to pass this on and give it to another developer in their own account. How do you do that? So those are things we're talking about now, is trying to get that worked out, where other developers could say, okay, here's a clone version of it. It'll just deploy the resources exactly like I have it, but in your own account. Yep. And again, the same thing for checking in code. Like, what do we check in? What type of get ignores do we have in there? Again, it's going to be one of those things where we can automatically deploy this, or we'll be able to do a little more continuous integration with this tool set. Yeah. So that's the configuration. Again, it's just any of the tools that you want to add, like Amplify add. I'll do auth piece just to show you what that looks like. And then, oh, I already has an Amplify. I already had auth set up. Oh, Amplify update. Let's try auth update. Jeez, I gotta spell. So here, if you want to just do username and password via Cognito user pools, the default configuration, again, it sets up like best practices for like, okay, it requires email, 8 characters or more, and then it'll assign us a identity pool, and then just say go, and that's basically all it is. And then it's building out a template, and then we deploy it, and then from there we will have a new information in our AWS configuration file, and then we use the SDK to make the calls and do a username password. And again, we're going to use this as a building mechanism for the later talks when we add auth or we add any of the other tool sets. We'll be able to use this, and then we'll add on to that, use the SDK, so it'll all kind of put the pieces together so you'll be able to see how it all works. Because right now we just added auth, but we really don't know how to use it. So we'll add those in another feature. But I just want to make sure we all know how to use the Amplify CLI, what it does, and what it's doing is feature-based, creating these CloudFormation templates, and then when you Amplify push, it's going to push this features to the cloud. And that's it. So I'm going to check online, see if there's any questions online. Anybody else have any questions about that? And again, after lunch, we can go around and make sure everybody has it installed and talk about some of the features. Yeah. Oh, yeah. We have a few minutes, right? Yeah, he was just asking about, we just want an iOS app just to start with. So, so I'll close this out. And if we just go to Xcode, so just any project, I'm just going to do create a new project here on Xcode. And then hit next, and I'll just do SFO test. And then my language is Swift. And then I want to save it to the desktop. And then if I run this, it'll just be a white page, a single view controller page, right? So then, and I saved it to the desktop. So then I can run this on my device or on the simulator, whatever I want. And so it's completely offline. I do whatever I want with it. So I'm going to quit out of that. And then from here, the terminal, I'm going to open up another shell tab. Here, I'm going to cd out of there. And then cd SFO test. So here's my project. I'll open this up bigger. So now I'm in my desktop in the SFO test project. And that's it. Same thing where this is my Xcode project because somebody gave me this project completely offline. And then here is where I would do an Amplify init in here. And this would be a brand new project. I'm going to cloud enable this. So if I want to add auth, I would do Amplify init, do the default authentication piece, and then I would add the SDK to the application, put the configuration file in Xcode, and then put a few pieces of lines, like 3 lines of code in there, and then launch the app. And if I wanted to log in, we have the built-in UI for that username and password, forgotten password, all those features are available. So that's, and the same thing happens like for if you do a React or React Native set up a project, and you're going to have different questions based on the environment. So again, remember if we did Amplify init, it's going to say, so hopefully choose iOS, or choose the default for the project, chooses iOS. And again, if this was Android, it would ask me a few other different questions like where things are and the res file, and then I go from there. So it knows kind of what to update. And really what it's looking for is those folder structures of what scripts are going to run, and then where am I going to put this endpoints, or where am I going to put these constant files for you when you enable or remove features in the CLI. Yeah. So online we see We have an RFC open for the multi-environments on GitHub, okay? And then check out issue 286 on Amplify CLI if anybody wants to comment. So there's again, the community is there. You'll see a lot of questions, a lot of issues. So if you have problems or if you want to enhance it, there's always, pull requests or, put in your questions in there and then it'll get addressed. So maybe AWS team will deploy some fixes or features, and then maybe somebody else will do a really cool feature that they're working on and do a pull request, and then we'll support it and pull it through. So that's pretty much it for the demo. We got a few minutes. If anybody has any questions regarding that tool set, hopefully everybody has a better understanding what the tool chain is and the CLI and what it can do as far as deploying features. Yeah. Oh, yeah, so she asked, how do you add the configuration file to your Xcode? And I'll show you real quick because that's really easy. But it's hard to close out a terminal. So if I'm here in my directory, I'm going to do SFO test. Okay, and then from here I can do open Xcode. So if I open SFO test.xcode project, so this is going to launch Xcode. Oh, I don't have, sorry, quit out of that. I'm going to go to the app, because remember I didn't do the whole deploy yet. So let me go to the back to that, what was I using? My app? Yeah, cd my app. So this is the one I set up. See the configuration file there? So now we're still a normal Xcode project. So I'm going to do open my app, Xcode project. And then here, I just choose, either one will work. You choose there the project folder, and you say add file to my app, and then it'll pull up the directory here, see the AWS configuration file. And then I don't copy if needed. I leave that unchecked because we want to make sure this is dynamic. So this is only one-time thing for Xcode. So we're going to add this to it here, and this is the only time we're going to have to add this configuration file. And again, this is the same one with the endpoints in there. So now when we go through and add and delete features, this will automatically, dynamically be updated for us. And then when we launch the SDK, use the SDK, it's pointing to these endpoints saying, okay, I want to use these for auth or analytics or whatever. So it's that simple. It's a one-time deal. And each project and platform is a little bit different, but this one's for iOS. And you add the configuration file that way. Yeah. Yeah. And I wrote, I've been writing a few blogs once a week. I did the auth for Google, Basic, and Google, Facebook, and Basic. And it's under medium/dmenace. If you want to go through the whole process, it talks about init, auth, pull the SDK in, AWS configuration file, run it, and you'll get to see the whole process. And about 7 and 9 minute reads if you want to take a look at those as well. That's for iOS Swift. And we're doing the same thing for Android. And Fizzy in the hall is my coworker, Adrian. He's online right now, and he's the one that's doing for the Android side. So we're kind of building it out based on as using AWS Amplify CLI as the tool to create the apps. Oh, medium.com/dmenace, I think it is, /dmenace. If not, I could show you offline. So let me check real quick questions online. I think that's it. Okay, let's have some lunch. Thanks.